Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Now, Morgan, I have to admit that while I was gone, I kind of wanted to have happy thoughts in my brain. So everything that's been going on with the coronavirus, I wanted to keep up with it.
Yeah.
But then it's scary.
Well, it's so funny because looking at the notes, I have a stack of notes, and I don't keep all the notes, but I try not to leave them lying around. I don't want anybody going, "What in the world? What's this guy
These
thinking
are the ramblings
about?"
of a madman.
Last week?
Huh?
Didn't you leave him here last week?
No, I left some of my articles, which had some notes and highlights on them.
Shriner loves that.
I know he does. I didn't bring him any this week, though. I was busy all weekend, so I have nothing printed out. I just have some scribbled notes. But I have my notes from past weeks, and I'm looking here, and I'm seeing coronavirus, 17,000 sick, 360 killed. And let me see, I had another one in here. Anyway, they're low numbers is my point compared to what we can share with you today. And, of course, these are just the reported cases. Yeah, I've got, and this must have been way early on. This is when they just had quarantined 41 million people in 13 cities. I've got 2,000 cases and 80 deaths. Now, you're talking about in China at the time. So the numbers we can share with you today, and I'm sure these are not even completely up to date because they're the latest ones I could find before we went on the air. And by the way, there was a press conference, which we'll tell you about, in China this morning, about 6 o'clock this morning. But now the latest figures for China and the coronavirus are 77,150 cases with 2,592 reported deaths. Now, remember, we've got some folks who might have some knowledge, like a Chinese billionaire who's in exile who says the numbers are closer to 1.5 million cases with 50,000 plus deaths. And by the way, that was a couple of weeks ago. But these are the reported numbers for China, 77,150 cases and over almost 2,600 deaths. South Korea, and I had to update these this morning because there were like 100 and something new cases disclosed overnight. But now they got 833 cases in South Korea, most of which center around this one particular church where a lady was sick and wound up getting a lot of people sick at the church. And they report 7 deaths in South Korea officially from coronavirus. Now, that's the numbers there are up. The number of reported cases are up 25% in 1 week. That's a lot of new cases. So we're trying to keep that under control outside of China. Obviously, they're having trouble within China controlling this, and the numbers are way off the charts compared to the SARS outbreak that occurred back in 2003, and, of course, way off the charts from the MERS outbreak. And these are very similar coronaviruses that occurred in 2012 or 2013. Now, what's interesting is Italy is now reporting 152 cases, and they say that the rest of Europe is getting ready to attempt to almost quarantine the state of Italy. 152 cases with 3 deaths. And, your big fear, or one of the big fears, I think, is coronavirus getting into countries that really have no effective means to do anything about it. Now, China's
if this was really in a biolab where it started, somebody's responsible, so they'd be keeping these numbers down.
Well, sure, and they've never identified patient zero. I mean, you're bringing up an interesting point because while they have now admitted that this didn't start in the wet market, the seafood market, where, look, they kill frogs and things like that, and it must have come from there. No, it didn't. That was the story they held to for a long time. I mean, obviously you can't trust the Chinese media. You cannot trust the official story coming out of China, and we've talked to you about that before. But they've never identified patient zero. Normally, in an outbreak of an epidemic, that's one of the first things you want to do. Who was the first case of this? Where did this start and come from? Because that's going to lead you potentially to ways to deal with it, right? And they've never identified patient zero. Now, they may know who it is, but they've not told us publicly who was the first person allegedly to get this. Did this come out of the lab there at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which seems to be the most likely candidate for this? We don't know. But one of the big fears you'd have is this getting into countries that don't have the ability to try to control this in any way. They don't have functioning national health systems that are sufficient to attempt to control this. I'm thinking of a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. You know, if this gets out there, they're going to be in big trouble. They just don't have the facilities. They don't have the money. They don't have the infrastructure to try and control this.
Or effectively treat people.
Just like with the Ebola outbreaks there. You know, and people get very suspicious, and particularly in a place like that where, I mean, witchcraft is still widely practiced, where they think, you know, the government is actually giving it to you if you go into the hospitals. If you report as sick, they're actually giving it to you. So don't go to the hospitals. Don't report yourself as being sick. But a place that might have echoes of that type of thing, in other words, a country that's not as developed, be Iran. And, you know, they've got 61 confirmed cases now in Iran. And as of late last week, they're reporting 8 deaths officially. That's now jumped to 12 deaths officially. And actually, Iranian lawmakers have come out and said that there are actually closer to 50 deaths. Now, if there are 50 deaths, it's pretty hard to believe that there are only 61 cases. And it's suspected, because they've got a number of people under quarantine in Iran, that there may be as many as 900 cases currently in Iran.
And if you stick to those first numbers in Iran, and you're talking, okay, there are only 61 cases, but that many deaths, that's about a 20% rate of death.
Which is much higher than what's being reported in China officially, and much higher than what's being reported in South Korea. You know, other things that are interesting about this particular virus is it's being reported that you can have it, supposedly get well, get over it, and then become reinfected. Now, normally your body would produce antibodies, and you would not be able to catch the same virus twice. So there would have to be a mutation. But in this case, apparently, and we don't know if a mutation is involved because there just hasn't been enough scientific study of it, but apparently in this case, you can become reinfected relatively easily. Now, this is really going to affect the Chinese economy. In fact, Chairman Xi, Emperor for Life, came out yesterday in China and said that this is a severe and complex epidemic and that it's going to have a big impact on the economic activity of China. And where we can see that is primarily in small businesses in China, what they call SMEs, or small and medium enterprises. And you're talking about everything from street vendors to small manufacturers. Now, this is where 80% of the Chinese population is employed. And what's the biggest problem that they're facing right now is the workers are not coming back to work. People are scared to death. They do not trust their government because the Chinese people have figured this out. They're smart enough to know that the government is going to lie to them repeatedly, and they don't trust the information coming out of their government. Now, we're the only ones people are like, well, no, you got to trust what the Chinese government says. I mean, are you kidding me? Don't be stupid. Chinese people don't trust what the Chinese government says. So they're actually staying home because the Chinese government is now saying it's safe to return to work. Let's get everybody back to work because they're realizing we cannot continue this situation, this quarantine where nobody's going to work, this extended Lunar New Year that's now gone several weeks past when it was supposed to be over. We can't keep this going. We absolutely can't keep this going. And interestingly, 1/3 of Chinese SMEs, small and medium enterprises, or small businesses, 1/3 of them have less than 1 month of cash remaining. So if they don't get back into production, if they don't get back into commerce, if they don't get back into selling, if the street vendors don't get back into selling the items that they sell to people on the street, they're going to run out of money and they're going to go bankrupt effectively. Although they don't really have a bankruptcy system in China like we do here in the U.S., but they're going to be out of money and they're going to stop functioning, cease to exist. And within 2 to 3 months, 85%, so it's a third, have about a month's worth of cash. Now, if you look at, okay, once you get to 2 to 3 months out, how many percentage of businesses are out of cash? It goes up to 85%. So, I mean, you're talking about there's only 15% of Chinese small businesses left if this goes on for another 2 to 3 months and economic activity does not restart. And so that's why they're rushing to restart. They're trying to say, okay, we got it under control. What we did worked. Now everybody get back to work. Let's pretend like it never happened. But the truth is they really don't have this under control. That's the truth. But they're realizing now we cannot keep going down the path that we're going, this quarantine path, this house arrest path where everybody's on lockdown. We can't keep this up. And so they've even started to offer incentives. Now, incentives come first, right? The carrot always comes before the stick. But they're trying to offer carrots. And so just to give you an example, Foxconn, which is not a small and medium-sized enterprise, it's a big business, Foxconn, but it's one of the main suppliers for Apple. Foxconn is offering its workers 7,000 won to return to work and work for 55 days. Now, that doesn't mean 55 days straight, but to return to work and including days off like weekends, to work the next 55 working days, they'll give you 7,000 won. That's equivalent to about $1,000 US. So that's no small bonus just to show up for work. And what's being reported, again, I don't trust these numbers, but what's being reported by Chinese businesses allegedly is that something around or less than 50% of workers are reporting to work. So they're half staff right now. And the rest do not want to report. They do not want to come in. And so that's why it may be why we're supposing that may be why they had this World Health Organization press conference this morning at 6 a.m. our time, Eastern time. That ran late. There was probably polishing up with the censors exactly what they were allowed to say. And exactly how do you want us, Chairman Xi, to present the information? What should we say here? And they came out with a lot of information that I think is pretty bland. And they came out and said things like, wow, the average age of people infected is 51. Primarily infects people aged 30 to 59 years old. 70% of the cases are from Hubei province. But the virus is age indifferent, they said. Now, what was important, because obviously they're not letting any of the truth out, what was important about this is they said the Chinese approach to lockdown has been effective. But they're warning, because other societies don't exist in authoritarian mode like China where you could just lock all these people down, this won't work in other societies. Now, let's flip back and see if they're telling the truth, because Jennifer Zing of Epoch Times has reported there are 50 to 60,000 people in hospitals in Wuhan. There were 18 crematoriums working 24/7, 3 of which have totally burned out from overuse. Got a little more when we come back. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.